that if you analyze the Quranic material and maybe some of the tafsir too, that there's reason to do Quran and Bible research. You introduced us briefly to this idea of, I think you pronounce it polysemy. I was saying polysemy, intertextual polysemy. How am I doing now with the pronunciation?
Well, I mean, I'm not an English professor. So
okay. All right, all right.
And who knows, it might be different, with British English pronunciation, Australian English, and, American English. So.
Yeah. I think you should add a little TM next to it, though, because I think of it as your term, like it's yours. So let's speak briefly. I don't know if we're going to get to the resurrection book because time is wasting away, but let's speak about this method, and which you introduced in the first book, Qur'anic Hermeneutics, between science, history, and the Bible. And maybe you could give us an example or two of how it works.
Sure. I can either give you an example from within the Quran, or perhaps between the Quran and maybe the Gospel of John. And maybe we can do that. Let's do between the Quran and the Gospel of John. So, for example, like one of the major things, like between the Quran and the Gospel of John, is of course the whole idea of the incarnation of the Word. So how does the Word, which is from God, or is God, therefore is divine, becomes incarnated, becomes embodied, becomes enfleshed? And this is basically like what many people would say, oh, but the Quran, of course, it has nothing to do with such a thing. But if we do really analyze the Quran a little bit closer, with certain terms that it uses, like for example, when the Quran speaks about the creation of the human flesh, it basically says that God speaks to the angels and tells the angels that when I form the flesh, فَإِذَا سَوَّيْتُهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. So when I form this flesh and breathe into it from my spirit, and then it says bow before it. So basically what is interesting, for example, it says سَوَّيْتُهُ, which means, to form. Usually that's how it is understood. But it's the same term that the Quran also uses about God sitting on its throne, which is istawa ala al-arsh. So basically, فَإِذَا سَوَّيْتُهُ, it's maybe like when God forms the human, just like God sits on its throne, and then breathes into it from God's own spirit, then it's as if, regardless, that is why in my book, I don't deal with theology or Christology. I simply say, well, let's just compare the texts. Theology, Christology, those are just interpretations of the text. But let's look at the texts themselves. If we look into whether the Spirit of God is, a creature, or it is divine, or whatever, that's not the issue, because the text doesn't say anything about that. But what the text say is that the Spirit of God came into that flesh, which appears to have been formed just like God sits on its throne. So it's as if this flesh is the throne of God now, and that the Spirit of God is sitting in there. So if the Spirit of God is, coming from God, even if you don't want to call it divine, or if you don't even want to call it God itself, it doesn't matter. But if it's coming from God, and that thing that is coming from God is now in flesh, and if the Word, which is coming from God, regardless whether you want to consider it divine or God itself, regardless, but then you do have these things. You have the Word in flesh, and you have the Spirit of God infleshed in the Quran as well. So in both places, we see something that is very, very similar. And we would be able to see that, especially when we use like polysemy, where a word has multiple meanings in the Arabic language, like sawaytuhu and istawa, for example. And by the way, even sawaytuhu could also be understood as sawaytuhu, which means made him my equal. So it is as if this bashar, this flesh, is now equal to God, right? That's also another way. In a polysemous reading, one could understand what's going on. It's as if this bashar is now equal to God. And then, of course, I'm not going to deal, with Christology, just comparing texts. And so if this word is infleshed, and this here in the Quran, it says that the Spirit of God is infleshed. So we do see that there's a lot of similarities, regardless of how people interpret it. That is why, for example, with the Gospel of John specifically, there is I have a full chapter specifically talking about the logos, about the word.
Mhm.
And because, one of the major stumbling blocks between, Muslims and Christians is Jesus begotten of God. And the Muslims will say, Astaghfirullah, right? Lam yalid wa lam yulad, right? God neither begets nor is begotten. And the Quran is very explicit that, Jesus is not walad of God. Very, very explicit. But then you do see that in the Gospel of John, that's basically, that Jesus is begotten. But then wait a minute. I mean, we need to try to understand the terms that's going on, the terminologies, the polysemy of the terminologies as well, and how they are engaging with one another. Well, what is interesting, like in the Greek language, to give birth or to beget, in other words, is from the root ginnao. And the root ginnao is simply the causative form of ginomai. And ginomai is the verb to be in the Greek language. Okay, what is interesting when we read the Quran, for example, whenever it basically says that Jesus is not walad, it immediately qualifies it with that whatever God wills, God says to it be, and it becomes. So according to the Quran, Jesus is not tawallad of God, not begotten through tawleed, right? But Jesus is takawwan of God. But wait a minute. If we look into the Greek language, ginomai is the verb to be, which would correspond to the Arabic, the verb yakun or kana. So what is the causative, like the causative form of yakun is takawwan. So ginnao in Greek can also be translated as takawwan instead of tawallad. So maybe what the Quran has perhaps no problem with the Greek term that is used in the Gospel of John, or even with the Nicene Creed, has no problem with the Greek term. It only has a problem with how it's translated into Arabic. So how is it translated in Arabic? The Quran seems to be very firm. Say takawwan, don't say tawallad. So it still means caused to become, still same meaning, because in the Greek language, there is no difference. That is why perhaps the author of the Gospel of John was very adamant to explicitly say, both in chapter 1 and chapter 3, to differentiate between that which is born of flesh and blood and that which is born of the divine. So very, very explicit because it's the very same Greek word. There's no other word. Maybe the Quran simply wants to use two different terms for it, which both would still correspond to the same Greek term anyways. And maybe what I suggest is perhaps the reason why the Quran is very adamant to use the verb be or kun fayakun and therefore takawwan, maybe because it's trying to interpret the Johannine logos. Because when we read, of course, the prologue of John is paralleling the prologue of Genesis. And if we read Genesis independent of John, we see that it is God who created everything. And the word that God creates everything with in Hebrew is Yehi, which, by the way, the Septuagint, of course, translates it as genithito, from, of course, geni, from ginomai, same term as
So
genao.
can I just throw in a couple of things here? So just in case people don't know all the references. So prologue of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Of course, it goes on for, 18, 19 verses with language about the Word of God and Christ who comes into the world. And then Yehi in Genesis 1 is basically let there be, usually rendered into English as let there be light, let there be. And then one more reference in the Quran, you said we have these references even for the creation of Jesus, where it's said when God wants to do something, be, and it is. So the Arabic word there is kun fayukun, right? So, okay, I didn't want to throw you off completely. Maybe I did, but you can complete the thought.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. So at least everybody would be with us on the same page now.
Right.
So basically, when in the beginning of John, where it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, according to Genesis, that word is Yahi or kun in Arabic, right? If I translate it in Arabic, it's genithito in Greek, for example. So it's the word kun or Yahi. And when John says, and the Word was God, well, of course it was God according to the Torah. Because how does God reveal God's self to Moses in Exodus 3:14? So in Exodus 3:14, God says, Ihya ashar ihya, I will be who I will be. So God basically says that God is Ihya. God is I will be. God is be. If I translate it, I mean, the Quran, for example, translates it, by the way, in 3 different ways, this encounter between Moses and God. In one translation, it translates as Inni an Allah. In another translation, it translates as Innani an Allah. And the third translation is Innahu an Allah. But if I want to literally translate the Hebrew, Ihya ashar ihya, it would actually be Akun man akun. So that's what it is, Akun man akun. So God is the Akun, in other words. And that is why perhaps the Quran says, don't say walad. Say takawan, it's kun fayakun. This is the word, that's the logos, that's what the Gospel of John is trying to convey. And that is what basically, without, looking into the terms, closely looking into the terms and how they correlate with one another, it would be difficult to see that. And I think maybe like you ask any Muslim in the street, Jesus is tawallad of God, they will say, astaghfirullah. No. But you ask them, is Jesus takawan of God? Yes, of course, absolutely, Jesus is takawan of God. But in Greek, it's the same. So I think Muslims and Christians for many centuries, they're just lost in translation. In essence, I think they believe in the same thing, but they're just lost in translation.